The time has come, my friends. It has been an exciting journey covering AMD's Ryzen CPUs. We started off the year with Ryzen 7, which offered fantastic multi-core performance while also being relatively inexpensive. A few weeks later, Ryzen 5 came to the horizon, showcasing great performance compared to Intel's mainstream set of processors like the i5-7500 and 7400. In some cases, it even knocked out Intel's $350 7700K, which was awesome. Say hello to Ryzen 3. This is AMD's take on a sub $150 CPU, or CPUs, because we'll be taking a look at two of them, the 1300X and the 1200. We'll put them through their paces compared to Intel's lower-end i3 variants and sort of judge for ourselves or analyze where it stands within the market, especially for gamers on a budget. But before that, a quick message from our sponsor.
The NZXT Hue Plus lighting control hub is now available in the white frame to complement the white NZXT Manta case or other white theme builds for best hardware color coordination, with enough extensions included, and is used to control the 4 very bright RGB LED strips or the Air RGB fans, all through the Hue Plus hub. Check it out in the description below.
Alright, before I move on, if you're interested in learning a lot more about the baseline Zen architecture and its various intricacies, I recommend you head over to our launch day coverage because it has everything covered. Link will be in the description down below. At the top of AMD's Ryzen 3 stack is the 1300X, priced at $130, which sports 4 physical cores and 4 threads, 2 MB of L2 cache, and 8 MB of L3. It's very much similar to the baseline Ryzen 5 1400 CPU, except that processor has 8 threads and lower base boost core clock speeds. Basically, this is a 1400 without SMT enabled. From a price to performance ratio, the 1300X could run head-to-head against the Ryzen 5 1500X in scenarios that don't necessarily require a large number of cores. AMD has given a very generous 3.5 GHz base clock speed for this CPU, and it can also run at a nominal 3.6 GHz on all its cores, provided adequate cooling is supplied. Meanwhile, the 2-core boost rate hits 3.7 GHz, while AMD's extended frequency range, or XFR, can pump things up to 3.9 GHz if we start throwing single-thread workloads at it. On the other hand, AMD's Ryzen 3 1200 looks about the same, except it has significant cuts to its frequencies. Its base clock of 3.1 GHz is still quite low, and unlike the 1300X, which allowed for a higher all-core boost speed, that baseline would still remain at 3.1 GHz until only when 2 cores are required. When that happens, you should see it boost to 3.4 GHz. Since this isn't an X series, part of the 200 MHz of additional headroom for XFR is cut down to just 50 MHz, so this CPU will run at a maximum of only 3.45 GHz even in single-threaded tasks. While this may all sound confusing, here's a quick chart which shows how both of these processors react in different scenarios. Now, when compared to what Intel offers, the 1300X's $130 price point aligns with the $140 4-thread i3-7300 CPU, whereas the $110 Ryzen 3 1200 would go against the $120 i3-7100 CPU. In addition, with TDPs of just 51 watts, the Intel i3 processors seem to be quite a bit more efficient as well. That doesn't mean that Ryzen 3 would require a beefier PSU. It would just run a few degrees warmer than Intel, but that would be a topic for another video. On paper, the thread counts on both Intel and AMD's processors look quite similar, but AMD could have an advantage here since their quad-thread layout is achieved through 4 physical cores, whereas the i3 CPUs are actually dual-core chips that have SMT enabled. Remember, SMT can add some latency into the equation. Another bonus feature is that Ryzen 3 is fully unlocked, so you can overclock it without a problem, but if you were on Team Blue, you'll need to pull out $160 for the i3-7350K, which honestly still doesn't make any sense these days, at least not with Ryzen 5 around. Just to quickly go over memory support, since it remains something of a minefield, AMD has indeed improved memory compatibility and stability with their latest microcode updates, but they still support 2400 MHz with dual rank DDR4 and 2666 MHz with single rank modules. You can get higher frequencies through overclocking or potentially using Ryzen certified memory kit, but for maximum compatibility, I'd recommend sticking to 2666 MHz and tightening timings to achieve better performance. Now, with Ryzen 3 processors achieving affordable levels, there is no doubt that AMD's B350 platform is a perfect companion for these chips. These motherboards have quickly become mainstream for folks who want access to all the benefits that Ryzen has to offer, like native NVMe storage connected directly to the CPU and a chipset that boasts USB 3.1 Gen 2 capabilities. AMD has also included a full stack of overclocking options on their more affordable motherboards, which is so refreshing to see when compared against Intel's much expensive Z270 platform. Do note that X370 does have support for dual graphics cards at X8 speeds, a few more chipset-derived SATA ports, and 2 more USB 3.1 Gen 1 nodes, but the vast majority of users won't need that extra connectivity anyways. B350's real selling factor is its price, with most well-equipped examples going for between $80 to $110. Take this Gigabyte B350 Mini ITX motherboard for instance. It's got all the bells and whistles that most gamers on a budget are looking for, like dual channel memory support, a M.2 PCI slot, USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type A, built-in RGB lighting, and much more. It's a solid foundation that one can build an amazing system moving forward. You know what's even awesome? Unlike the higher-end Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5 lineups, all Ryzen 3 processors come with Wraith Stealth coolers. Now, many tend to disregard this inclusion, but if you're strictly, and I mean strictly, on a budget, these coolers are quite decent, and it should even provide some more thermal headroom for overclocking. I would not consider picking up an aftermarket solution simply because you could use that money towards other components like a faster GPU or a nice looking case. Ultimately, it's your call. And now, I think it's about time to reveal the benchmarks, so prepare your bodies. Are you ready? Bam. Let's kick things off with a little bit of AIDA, a benchmark suite that uses high-level algorithms to simulate different processing scenarios. Here we see that the 1300X and 1200 compete pretty well against the i3-7300 and i3-7100 respectively, except in PhotoWorks, which tends to use a single core. Other benchmarks show the usual Ryzen highlights in multi-threaded environments, particularly in AES decryption and hashing algorithms. The CINEBENCH multi-core results have quite a strong showing for AMD's new chips, with the 1300X handily beating Intel's 7300 and actually coming close to the i5-7500. The Ryzen 3 1200 did pretty well too, but there's a massive gap between the Ryzen 3 CPUs due to the 1200's very low frequencies. Moving on to PCMARK, and there's not really much different to talk about, with the 1300X and 1200 trading below the Intel i3 series depending on the workload. WPRIME backs this up too, but again, the 1300X shows some amazing results while the 1200 lags quite far behind, even though it does beat the 7100 by a narrow margin. Moving on to single core results, and this is an area where AMD's Zen architecture may have made some big inroads, but it still can compare to what Intel can offer. It is great to see these very affordable processors competing with higher-end Ryzen CPUs, but Intel really does dominate here. Next up, we have some benchmarks a few more of you may be able to relate to. 7-Zip shows the Ryzen 3 processors exactly where we would expect them, ahead of the 7300 and 7100. Meanwhile, Adobe Premiere really likes those two Ryzen 3 processors since they score very well in our 4K media encoder video test. As a matter of fact, with a little bit of overclocking, the 1300X shouldn't have any problem achieving results that are pretty close to the Ryzen 5 1400. However, Blender shows that the Ryzen 3 1200 just can't keep up with the competition due to its lower clock speeds. That's a bit of a problem since these rendering tests have been a strength for AMD. Luckily, the 1300X performs very well given its price. Corona has pretty much the same results as Blender, with the 1200 lagging behind the 1300X, really showing some strength. But when we move on to programs like GIMP, which uses between 1 and 2 full worker threads as it processes an image, things don't look good for Ryzen processors. However, this is absolutely nothing new since Intel has always been ahead in lightly threaded workloads. HANDBRAKE's video conversion tool seems to be a great fit for AMD since the 1300X and 1200 both come up with some amazing results. As a matter of fact, not only does the Ryzen 3 1300X handily beats the i3-7300, but it also comes close to matching the 8-core FX 8370 guys. That's pretty awesome. Even POV Ray shows these very good numbers, so it looks like there are certain applications that really do benefit from 4 physical cores, while others seem to prefer Intel's higher clock speeds and SMT. WINRAR is a bit of a mess for AMD, unfortunately, since it has integrated optimizations for Intel processors and it only uses a few processing threads. That's the perfect storm for AMD, and they lose by a big margin. And now onto some game tests. Starting with Firestrike, and the scores are actually very, very good indeed. The Ryzen 3 1300X keeps ahead of the i3 7300, while the 1200 does the same against the Intel 7100. The DX12 TimeSpy benchmark brings things a bit closer, but even in that situation, the AMD processors are still able to come out with a narrow win. But what does that really mean for in-game tests? Well, let's find out. Ryzen just can't seem to catch much of a break in games, and despite being a game that was heavily sponsored by AMD's Battlefield 1, shows the Ryzen 3 processors very close to the back of the chart. Here, the i3 7300 is more than 10% faster on average than the 1300X, and the i3 7100 is nearly 15% faster than the 1200. Deus Ex sees the graphics cards become a lot more of a bottleneck, so the top end of the processors between the Ryzen 5 1400 and i7 7700K literally offer the same performance. That includes the surprisingly fast Ryzen 3 1300X as well. The 1200 shows some respectable results too. I have a funny feeling that we will see these new Ryzen 3 processors in quite a few entry-level MOBA and FPS rigs, so performance in Overwatch is pretty important. While neither Ryzen 3 CPU can directly compete with the i3 processors, they do put up quite the effort. That 1200 though simply doesn't have the stock clock speeds necessarily for adequate gaming performance. Call of Duty, on the other hand, exhibits a game engine frame rate cap, so pretty much all the processors perform equally. So let's move on. Much like Call of Duty, Doom has an in-engine rendering cap that limits performance to 200 frames per second. However, while the Ryzen 3 1300X is able to keep up with the big boys, as is the more affordable Ryzen 3 1200. Rounding out the game testing is a bit of an oddity. Even though the Grand Theft Auto game engine is DX11 based, it absolutely loves two things: many threads and Intel processors. That means the Ryzen 3 1300X and 1200 come a bit short against the usual i3s, but not by a huge margin. As for power consumption, I wanted to spend a bit of time explaining these results. There's no denying both of these new Ryzen 3 processors are quite efficient, but they are also showing what happens when quad-core parts go up against dual cores. Remember, these are essentially 8-core chips that have half their logical processor nodes cut, and that itself leads to some efficiency losses. As a result, against Intel i3s, Ryzen 3 really doesn't fare all that well in the power consumption department. This isn't to say that Ryzen 3 is inefficient, since it sips electricity when compared to AMD's lineup of 6 and 8 core chips, but it won't win many performance per watt competitions against Intel. Okay, so now on to overclocking, and I definitely had a lot of fun playing around with the 1300X and the 1200. Let's start with the 1300. I got it to about 4 GHz with a core voltage or offset voltage of 0.15 and an SoC voltage offset of 0.10. The CINEBENCH score is significant compared to the stock score that we were able to achieve. I was only able to get the 1200X to about 3.7 with a core offset voltage of 0.14 and an SoC voltage of 0.10. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to memory or overclock the memory for some reason. Even 2666 or even 2400 megahertz did not work. So it is something that AMD still needs to address. I guess we just have to wait for motherboard or motherboard updates for their BIOS, for their respective BIOS. In my case, I was using the Asus Prime B350 Plus. It's an excellent option for a B350 based motherboard, but I guess you know, since this is a new series of processors, we just have to wait for a future update to fix memory overclocking.
Oh hey there, NCIX.com is Canada's leading e-tailer for anything your mind desires. Just keep within those categories, which are plenty, and get tempted by the weekly deals. Visit NCIX.com for all them sweet deals.
Alright guys, so this has been a long one, so I'm going to wrap it up here with a few of my own thoughts and recommendations. Personally, I enjoyed my time testing the Ryzen 3 1300X and 1200, which is actually sitting at my test bench over there. It exactly shows how AMD is going after Intel where it counts, while also providing excellent performance for people on a budget. Now, before you hop into the Ryzen 3 bandwagon, there are some things that you need to be aware of. For the most part, these processors will be beaten by Intel's i3 series in gaming and some lightly threaded applications. That's simply the nature of the Ryzen versus Kaby Lake equation right now. But I personally feel like Ryzen 3 offers better value for gamers than what an i3 could. You see, overall platform cost is extremely important, and when one of these new AMD processors is combined with a B350 motherboard, it becomes nearly impossible to beat for someone on a budget. Remember that unlike the i3 series, Ryzen 3 processors can easily make up any performance deficiency by overclocking, and overclocking is fully supported on B350. Even though both of these processors have their strengths and weaknesses, I feel like Ryzen 3 1300X is a lot more appealing than the 1200. Its high frequencies go a long way towards competing against the i3 7300, and at some points it even starts knocking on the i5 7500's door. Honestly, I can't recommend the Ryzen 3 1200 simply because the 1300X only costs $20 more. You could sacrifice a few Starbucks coffees to afford that because I think that from its stock performance to its overclocking headroom and price, the 1300X is still one of the best processors available in the market today. And that's one of the reasons why we're giving it the HardwareCanucks Damn Good and Damn Good Value Award. Well, that concludes this review of Ryzen 3. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think about these new processors in the comments down below. I'm your with HardwareCanucks. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more similar content. Stay tuned for a very cool ITX Ryzen build guide for under $1,000. It's in the works. But yeah, stay tuned for that video, and we'll see you in the next one.